Hello, and welcome to the workshop for 3D compositing workflow. My name is Michael DiCaprio. I am the president of NJIT SIGGRAPH, and I will be walking you through the workflow for 3D VFX compositing into footage, and I'll be using Cinema 4D and After Effects. And along the way, I'll note that certain things I'm going to cover will be available to do in other programs along the way. So let's just jump right in. So the first step you're going to want to do is footage preparation. You have the piece of footage you want to do. You got like a nice shot that you want to put something in, whether it's a shot of the sky and you want to put in like a spaceship going through it, or if it's the shot of a city and you want to put trash in it like I do. So this will mainly consist of After Effects. You could use Nuke, but the main goal you want to do with the footage before you get started on everything is stabilize it. So you'll have this shaky footage of going through stuff and whatnot, and that's going to be very difficult to deal with because the way we're going to put an object in there is to track the environment, and it's going to have to solve for points, and it's going to be a lot more difficult if the points are all jittery all over the place. So a good thing that After Effects has as just a regular effect is the warp stabilizer. That can just be found in the effects panel here. Just type in warp and it's like there, and you just double click on that with your footage selected and you have it right in here. So this was it before. This is with all like the default settings for warp stabilizer. Turning it on, and normally you would hit analyze and have that kind of solve for every frame, but I've already let that go. Much smoother. Now After Effects does render a bit time, but boom, super smooth. Now, keep in mind, this is also shot on this is shot on my phone, and I had a gimbal stabilizer, but it still had that jitter as before. So even with like a gimbal stabilizer, this warp stabilizer, or whatever Nuke would call it, because you could also use Nuke for this. I think the warp stabilizer is also in Premiere, but you don't really want to do VFX in Premiere. Even with the stabilizer, this is a nice added layer to keep it much more, stable. And another thing to keep in mind is when you're actually collecting the footage, and film shoots will even have a VFX supervisor on the field to, say which shot could be, what tweaks to the shot the director wants to make would be better for the actual VFX. I know David Fincher, who is responsible for Fight Club, The Social Network, Girl with a Dragon Tattoo. He is first a VFX guy and second a director, and you can see this in a lot of his breakdowns and stuff. He is always keeping the eye on the actual footage to make sure it's good for VFX. So these are some ways to just sort of prep it all nice. If there are any glitches through it, the advanced thing tends to, if it's a little glitchy, you can always turn on the detailed analysis. Rolling shutter is if everything kind of jitters, this will try to smooth it out. But yeah, other than that, you're pretty much solid. There is one other thing that you want to do to prep your footage that I'll get into next, because now we're talking about the tracking. So tracking can be done in Nuke, After Effects, Cinema 4D, like right from the actual 3D software as well. You can also do it in Blender, certain kinds of tracking, and that's mainly, I think, point tracking and object tracking. But if you're going to put something in your scene, you're going to want to use 3D camera tracking. Point tracking is mainly used when you want to record the movement of a specific object through the scene. 3D camera tracking is when you want to generate the world again in a 3D space, and the only thing that actually moves is the camera. So it will take the footage and solve for a virtual camera. And I'm going to go into that process now. So what's a good thing to do with After Effects is to nest your compositions. Nuke is a node-based software. After Effects is a layer-based. And it, node-based is probably more preferred, but I learned most of my stuff with After Effects. But once you stabilize this, you're going to want to make it its own composition. You just go into the project, and here's your composition, and you can just drop it onto that icon and have a new composition made for that. But I already did that, and we got it over here. So here it is, just really just the stabilized clip over here, and I'm going to explain what all these layers are in a bit. But with this now stabilized, you can go over to your effects and search for 3D, what is it called? I think it's 3D camera. Yeah, 3D camera tracker. 3D camera tracker ignores masks, effects. Yeah, so this is the reason why you should have it all in a pre-composition. Why you stabilize, then compose it, and then you use the new composition you made, because you won't have any of the effects in the sides when you do that. But I actually do have some effects that I made use of, and we'll get into these later. I did have to put a warp stabilizer on this because this isn't the composition. So we can actually delete that and actually, because it's the same thing as I made, take that composition from before, and it's directly from this. So here's the warp stabilizer on that, and in the new comp it is no longer present. So here you can take your 3D camera tracker, double click that, and it will automatically start analyzing it. This can take a while depending on how many frames you're doing, but the point is to get a point cloud. And this is sometimes easier when your footage has higher contrast on different areas. So if you go back to the original thing, how we stabilized it, another thing you can do is add a curves effect. Actually, we're going to see how well this is coming along. We're going to see how this looks, and then I want to show you the strategy. So here you have all these points. They're kind of small because this footage is 4K. But if you increase their size, you have all these points around here, all generated. And when you scrub past the footage, you see that they all move, and they're all well, nice and tracked. But sometimes if you don't edit the curves of the footage, some of these points can pop in and pop out. They won't really have too much data to latch onto. So if you go into the original composition with a stabilizer, you can create an S-curve, and an S-curve raises the highlights and lowers the shadows, makes it very contrasty, and you can try to find like a nice space to have that. This isn't really final. This is really only for the tracking. So once it looks, good and contrasty, you can go back here and reanalyze it. And it'll go through its whole process again, and it should have either more solid points or, points that last longer throughout the range of the clip. It's not like you're not going to keep it. You're not going to keep the curves on there. You're going to discard them after you get that track data. But we got to process the track data after this. So it does take a bit. And this is only less than a 3-second clip. So keep that in mind So we're going to take the data and generate a point cloud once this is done solving. So yeah, now that it's solved, you can see over here there's a lot more than there was, and you can select them and have that there. There's a lot more in areas that it didn't pick up very easily before, whether they were bleeding in with the sun or whatnot. So from here, this is just on the effect. So if you click out of that, it won't really have any bearing over anything. You're going to want to click back into the effect on the clip. That way you have, all these points. And here's where you just kind of have to guess a little bit. You're going to see these circles, these targets pop up between a lot of points. And you can also select a few. And the goal is to get a nice plane and to if you had a 3D plane tacked onto this building, which direction would it be facing? What would it look best like? I just clicked into the other comp, but you can zoom in here, and what'll help is see if this window will give a good result. It's okay, but you can even just go along here, and then you can right click here and create a solid and a camera. So you'll have now a solid put in the scene and a 3D tracker camera there. It's all solved and made right. So it looks a bit wonky the way it does. This is not the direction we want it really facing, but you can easily just go in there because it is tacking to the points and it is moving. If it were kind of clipping through that wall, that's where we'd want it to be clipping through that wall. But you can also just rotate it in After Effects. This is all because After Effects does have a partial 3D engine. Just get that, where it might be. It's iffy, but it works. But that's just to kind of test it. The point that we really want here is back over here. You're going to want all these nulls. You're going to want to select them because that's the that's what's going to give us the point cloud. So you go back here and you're going to select all these points, right click, create 300 nulls because we already have the camera. So it's literally going to generate all these as nulls, which will effectively take them out of the effect and be these 3D data points in space. Okay. So we can actually click outside of the 3D camera tracker, and to show you what this did, I'm going to hide the footage. And you can see all these points in space moving as if they were part of that scene. So it's a lot. We got 300 here. And the more complex the scene, the more things you want tracked, the more data you allow to be shown with the S-curve, which you can actually just go ahead and delete now. The more of these points there's going to be, and the more of them you're going to have to, manage. So from here, you can export these points directly into Cinema 4D. After Effects comes with Cinema 4D Lite. So you can actually have all of there's an extent to what can be exported into Cinema, but the pipeline and workflow between After Effects and Cinema 4D is extremely tight. And it works very well. So by hitting that, it will generate and I already had one because this is all for my thesis, so you get to see it all. I have it in here. So it will create a C4D file, and then you can go ahead and open that. I'm wondering how much of this has been edited, but we will see. Okay. So here's what I have from Cinema. I created those solids, like I said before. Sometimes they're a nice reference to the planes and whatnot, but the nulls do suffice as well. And here is exactly what you would get when you open it up. You can track through it and see all those points moving like that. So now you're going to want to recreate the scene. It's not as daunting and scary as it seems because you have all these reference points and you don't have to actually recreate the scene. You're really just recreating what you need based on what you want to put in, using the nulls that you just exported as reference points in space so that you can get the right depth away from the camera and everything, looks good. So what this will involve doing, or what you really need to get started, is having the footage as a reference, because right now we're flying a bit blind. And what we can do that will greatly help is dropping in a background and then a new material and putting that material on the background. But wait, there's more. You will go into the material settings. You really only want color here. And this can apply for Blender as well. Or they'll have their own background settings, but the whole idea is to get the footage in the background, and this is how you would do it in Cinema. So we can go here, and where we have our footage stored, it's prepped. That should be right. Yeah. Okay. Now I know that it has to be animated there. Yeah. Alright, so now we have it in the background, and you can see all those points moving along it, and those planes that were exported from After Effects are going right on those building fronts. Another helpful trick to do is if you want a better idea of your space, or if you want to edit, first off, if you want to edit things more freely and don't want to mess with the camera that After Effects exported, you can unhook from the camera. Now the problem is that the background stays. So to work around this, you can hide the background and take that same material and put it on all these panels. And in the settings for the material on the object, you can change it from UVW mapping to camera mapping, and then select the camera, and then fix that aspect ratio because for some reason it defaults to 4:3. Put that to widescreen, and then you can just repeat same. Yeah. So now you can move around, and these will stay based on where the camera projects them. So if you link back into the camera and scrub through and you see them moving and you turn back on the background, it's like they're right there. So unlinking that, and they'll stay in relation to the camera. So it's a good way to keep your scene visualized when you're not focused on the camera, and allows you to, put whatever you want in here. So next, I would assume, is the part of putting something in there. What do we want to put in there? I am doing a thesis related to global warming, and my goal is a PSA. It's like 30 seconds, and it has trash flying through the city to sort of emphasize that this is a problem. And the name of my thesis is Time to Face the Music, and I have audio reactive garbage flowing through it because there's more of it than there is of us. And New York City is very polluted with that. So I have a bunch of garbage flying through that. So we want to put that in this created scene. What would help, though, if you can see it looks a bit wonky, what would help is if your footage has a visible ground plane. Because then, this is going back to After Effects, then once you have your track data all here, you can actually select points on a ground. These aren't on the ground, but I'll just use them to make my point. Right click and then set ground plane and origin. And what that will basically say is, or what that'll do is it'll solve for the angle of where your camera is in relation to the ground, and it will, you know, not generate this wonkiness. But as can be seen in this footage, the ground is constantly being obstructed by cars and it's in motion, and there's not a lot of contrast to define where it is. So you can work like this. It doesn't really matter. If it irks you a bit much, you can, you know, rotate all of it, because it does parent everything you export into that. So you can reorient it all. I'm going to fast forward in my timeline and cut to here, where I put something in there. So this was the final file I used for my thing. I have a squiggly line there, and all these nulls are not coming through. But why? This is why. Okay, yeah. So here's the scene that I had. I built off of it a bit more. I added a few more planes for reference to get, you know, the stream right in the way I wanted it in relation to that. Kind of gauging by eye how far everything is from itself, based on where these nulls were. Because I think in here I did have a oh, I have to recache everything. Okay, yeah. So I have this effect. We're gonna get to that. There was like a lamppost that went by, and I made note of that. So here's the signpost, or it was like signage, road signs. I made note of which nulls were that in After Effects, so that I could easily find that in Cinema. So I knew the distance between the building fronts and where that sign was, and I could accordingly put the effect that I wanted in there. So what I did here is, you know, I put in a spline. I have my garbage going through that. It has a sound effector on it, so it's jumping to the music. Look at all this wonderful garbage. Delicious. But yeah, so I put it in there. Making this kind of stuff isn't the point of this workshop specifically, but I made stuff and I put it in there. That's what we wanted to get to. And it's very easy because everything's static. It's a static scene. You just drop something in there, make it move on the way it wants, and the camera will record it as if you were always there. And you can even see, you know, further along the timeline you go, the camera will move accordingly. I just have a lot of information there. You can even see, click the camera, you can see the path it takes right here. Everything is keyframed, so it's really convenient in that way. So now comes the fun part. You gotta render it. Now, this can be done a few different ways depending on your circumstances. So depending on your environment, the lighting conditions and whatnot, comping it will require a few different levels of technicalities. And the great thing about the footage I took here is that it's an overcast day. Soft lighting surrounding everything. Shadows are barely present. You know, they're just directly under an object. Everything, there's no hard shadows, there's no direct stuff like that. So that was a little reassuring for me. I didn't have to get too complicated. But there are a few ways to go about the rendering process. The biggest thing is multipass and AOVs. So say you do have a heavy, you know, heavy sunlight on a day, you're gonna want to recreate your scene to the point where you will have like a plane on the bottom or wherever a plane would be. This is why a ground plane origin points are useful. So you would basically take one in there, realign it to everything like that, and let's just, assume that this is where the floor should be, kinda, and is a lot bigger. So say you have that, you will have to set up the lighting conditions to mimic the footage. The best way to do that is to find an HDRI that kind of matches those lighting conditions. HDRIs are 360 things. I usually just go to, let's do that, yeah, HDRI Haven. And they have a whole, these are all free, and they're up to like 8K, or you really only need 4, but if you have complex reflections, they're helpful. So you can find a good enough, lighting scenario that matches the footage you took. You could also set up your own lights and do it that way, which is a little more complicated, but if you have a stronger knowledge in that and you find that easier to manipulate, by all means do that, because you just need to get the accurate render appearance. So I forewent the ground plane because I didn't have that data and I only have a few weeks left for this. But the way you could get that, and only that, is actually a few ways. I think I talked about shadow catchers. Yeah, there are a few rendering softwares. I think Arnold might have something similar, but it creates a matte shadow catch. So you can create a material to put on the ground. Is that even the right one? Yeah. And in here, matte, yeah, a matte shadow catcher, and just bypass the material. And what that does is it essentially just catches the shadows on an alpha. So you can tweak the material, or the material that you won't see, with different properties here to catch the diffuse channels of all the stuff you have rendering, catch the shadows, and it will basically just render on an alpha. So that's an easier way to do it. The more commonplace way is, as I was saying, Multipass and AOVs. So Multipass really is just, we'll do it the Redshift style because that's what I have available at the moment. And I think I can also go through the physical one. Yeah, Multipass. You'll have these different filters, almost is the best way to put it, or stencils or whatever, that will only render out those specific things. So you'll have lens effects if you want to render those out. Some of these aren't actually that, but ambient occlusion paths is a Multipass option. I'm more familiar with Redshift. I kind of got on this train earlier on than anything else in cinema. But with Redshift, you can go to the AOV section, and here's where you'll have all of the different kind of layers you can add. You can add ambient occlusion, what's this, shadows. Just thinking of all of the things that you might need for stuff. Object IDs are also good because then you can assign an object ID and only render out that thing without destroying the scene that you made, without deleting any of that stuff. But you can also go here. Some will have the AOV managers, and you basically select which ones you want, if you want them denoised specifically, and if it's a direct output. So if it's within the file or if it's its own separate file. So to avoid having all these different files, the best way to do this is, it was in here, to render it out with a multi-part EXR. So I don't use EXRs as often as I should. I know Nick does a lot and lives by them. I have yet to.
EXRs are wonderful.
I have yet to fully integrate them or learn their wonder. But they literally will have all of these passes in the same file, and you can open them up in Photoshop and see all of the different passes there. As well as when you go into an easier, more free-form compositing program like Nuke, you can use the shuffle node and literally just shuffle out the different passes so that they can be implemented in the same from the same file. So it's a lot more organized by having EXRs. The way I was rendering, we'll just do that. The way I've rendered these scenes is the way you kind of saw them when I opened this up. I did just, hide everything else, and I only had this. I just wanted to deal with the effect, and I have my IPR over here. You can just see the effect right there. I tweaked it a little bit, or how I did the lighting for this was I took an HDRI, and I found one from HDRI Haven that matched it kind of closely, and then I did a little tint tweaking because it was a little too cold, so I made it a little bit warmer. And then I just kind of ignored all the other stuff in the scene because of it being an overcast day. There wasn't too much else I had to account for, and the things that I could account for I could do in After Effects as well. But you can also see, what is this? This is the bad one. Let's just get rid of that. We don't want that. We want the render view. Yeah, okay. So as you can see, it's basically the same thing, but I have better control over that. So you can see the alpha. So what's black will be transparent, and what's white will have that. And there's my water bottle, which is transparent-ish. So that's going to be cool. Yeah. So I just rendered this out. I did use motion blur because I'm like that. You can just add the motion blur in there. It depends on your render or whatnot, but you add what you want to it just to flourish it up a bit. You don't need motion blur, but anyway, I'm detracting. Yeah, so this is the point where you just render it out. The best way to do this is a PNG sequence. It's, in case your computer crashes, the last frame that was rendered, you always have it, and every frame before it. Never export out to an MP4. And if you're trying to do transparency, don't do an AVI either. Just generally avoid AVIs. They're the most raw, destructive force on nature. They will consume all of your computer's resources and give you little to show for it. Try to do a PNG sequence if you're not directly putting out sound, or if you can add the sound back in later. I do have a sound effector on this, but I rendered out with a PNG sequence and then added the sound later. So I saved that, and then I imported it back into here. So I got back to here, and I went to my project settings and just, imported it. What's the best way to just right click that, import file, and like here you can see, you just click the first PNG in the sequence and then import the PNG sequence. So I did that, and then I added it on top of here, and accounting for resolution changes you can swap out and whatnot, it popped in like that. Well, not exactly like that. I did do a little tweaking. So once you render, it's time for the comp. This is where you will tweak and make it fit a little bit. Use minor color correction to get it fit back into the scene. And this is the most strenuous part of it, because you have to make it believable if that's what you're going for. You have to make it live in the scene that you did not create. You have to, composite. So that involves kind of changing a little bit the color. So I tweaked the color here just by dropping in a Lumetri color it has all these different settings that you got. Also a curve editor, highlights, shadows, all these different things. I changed the contrast a bit, but to give a little insight on how it looked, this is what it looked like. It was a little dark. So adding that, I brought up the highlights and made it fit. You change the white balance, you get it good. I think another thing I added here was just a light drop shadow. Yeah. So it looked like it was interacting a bit more with the environment. It's very subtle, but it adds a little bit, and these things do add up as it goes along. I thought it was missing something on the ground, and I didn't want to play around with, you know, catching too many shadows, so I literally just took the footage, added a drop shadow onto it, selected shadow only, did a few more tweaks, and then had my shadow of it on the ground. And I just turned it into a 3D object and rotated it and laid it out there. And it's all still animated, and it looks as if there is a shadow. It's not the most accurate shadow, but for a less than 3 second clip, you can kind of see how it all comes into play. Yeah, so that was added. Now, here's the very fun part. As you can see here, it is going around this sign and over this bus, and that's not good. It should not be doing that. And the shadow too also goes over this guy's hoodie over here, and on the bus a bit. So we got to cut those out, and what that involves is Roto. It's a lot of work. You will go mad. It will make you mad, but you must do it. Roto can be easy. Very rarely is it ever. So I have 3 rotoed layers here. I have one for the hoodie, one for the bus itself, and one for the sign. So there are a few ways to go about Roto. The easiest, and if you have a drawing tablet, this is also very easy, is to use the Roto brush. And I did that a bit for this blue hoodie layer. If it just popped into that. Yeah. So for the blue hoodie, track point, here we go. So this was all of the data that was generated from the Roto brush. Okay, it's not gonna like that. Let's see if I can show it without destroying all this. Here. Yeah, so we can click into that, and I'm gonna take my pen out, my tablet. All right, so now that you're in the Roto brush tool, you can just paint the line around the object. That alt click will, delete, and you can solve for it like that. Just playing it will. It's very time consuming, and it may or may not come out the best. So what you want to do, or what you will do after this though, if it does come out the way you like it, is to freeze it. And that will kind of set it in stone so that if you change the resolution or anything like that, or you close and come back, it's not stored in the cache anymore. It's frozen. It's locked in place, and then you can edit the things like feather and contrast and, whatnots. So, the other way, oh wow, wonderful. Go down here and delete that because we don't need that. Okay, but I did that already. So I had it here, as you can see. So the feathering it's all just a way to get it, smoother and not as jaggy as before, while also keeping out the things you want to be in the background. Yeah. So we did that for this, and then for the bus, I did a more manual way of rotoing because the highlights can get a little lost in the other stuff. So if I were to use the brush, it might start attaching to other things, and I wanted clean, sharp lines out of this. Roto brush is great for stuff like, cloth, things that are folding, hair, stuff that have like very meticulous details. That's the right phrase. But for a smooth line, a roto brush might create too much jitter. So I just went in there and created a mask and did that, frame by frame as it moves along to get to the point. But instead of actually manually doing frame by frame, even though you end up doing that in the end anyway, you can start it off with a mask tracker. So in your tracker tab, once you create the outline of a mask, you will go, solve for it that way, and it will attach to as many points as it can kind of attach to, track it through the footage. It does fail a little bit here and there. So that's where, manually coming in and adjusting it for all the points, making sure you get them frame by frame as nice as possible. You just got to do that for everything, for your entire life, all the time. So Roto is a very intensive process. That's why it's often, sent overseas into these wonderful Roto farms, wherever they may be, and then sent back to, companies to actually process the VFX. So Roto itself, the concept of it is very simple. You're cutting out a moving image, and you want it to change the foreground, background, that kind of stuff. The process, the better the result you want, the more time and detail and focus you have to put into all the layers. So doing this sign layer was incredibly fun to do. And I think I even screwed it up a little bit. Did I? No. Okay, we're back. Yeah. So every frame was just a little bit shifted in terms of the signs in the, hanging out the back, because the closer I was walking towards it, the flatter it was becoming. So the detail I had starting here was different, later on down the line. But once all that's done, and you get the roto out of the way, and you tweaked everything the way you like it, then comes the finishing work. And this is the nice time. This is more of the creative aspects of it. You color it, you can add post effects. It's a joyous time for everyone involved, I think. It's a nice pastime for me, because after you do the horrors of fighting through the jungles of rotoscoping and tweaking all your render settings time after time and iteration after iteration to make sure everything matches right and looks right, and something's still not going over something else, or there's no overlap in a certain area, then you can have the nice reward of a cool color process. So this is what my final shot looked like. I wanted a gritty look, very cool toned, and I wanted it to kind of, I wanted to give it a bit more of a premium look than just cell phone footage. So I was cheap and I added a vignette, of course, which is a nice quick way to make things look a little bit more cinematic. But I did something a little more clever that I wanted to play around with. I changed the optics a bit around the edges. it's a little more warped. And I wanted to go for like a chromatic aberration kind of look. So you can see how that box is a little cut off as to there. I'm basically just added the optics compensation and changed the field of view. And that makes things crazy. A good thing to keep in mind with the post effects is now is the time to really make things look uniform. You're putting the same style over everything so it can blend better. And a great cheap way to hide any little, resolution mistakes is noise. So I rendered out the actual thing in 1080, whereas the footage was 4K. I'm probably going to go back for the final version after I tweak the dynamics of the stream a bit more. It's all about the tweaking. So a great way to hide any, rendering mistakes, or even if you want to add fake detail to the background, is to just drop a little noise in there. And actually that's color noise. You want to turn on the noise. Yeah. Drop a little noise. It gives it a little bit more texture to the scene. And being that it's a uniform kind of filter overlay on all of this stuff, it does kind of bring it all a bit more together. Yeah. And the way I wanted to accomplish that chromatic aberration, as I was talking about, and have the split RGBs on the sides, is by shifting these channels. I'm actually just gonna delete these and show you exactly kind of how I went about it. So you have this one, and if you want to split them RGBs, shift channels, you get all your red, greens, blues. Gonna want to duplicate that twice, make the top one red and turn the other channels full off. You can keep alpha. Alpha never hurt anybody. I don't think it did. This one you're gonna do full off and just leave the green. Bottom one, just gonna leave the blue. And then you're going to want to blend the modes, because down here you can have the ability to switch the parameters. So you can change the blend modes in this one, and if you toggle that, you can actually change which layers are hidden, or when you hide them. That's a good thing to do with all the nulls when you're tracking, to just keep them out of the way. Also, you can turn a layer into a 3D thing. You can also add more motion blur if you want, but that's if something's actually moving in After Effects, not moving and then rendered in After, or not moving and then rendered and then put in After Effects. So as long as it's moving in After Effects, you can add motion blur to it. But we want to toggle that back to get the blend modes. Do either add or linear dodge, or the same thing. And now it's back to normal-ish. But everything's slightly different because they're layered. And here, you can now change the field of view. I'm going to zoom in on the sides of a later level and just pull those RGBs apart without affecting the main subject. Another one like that. Yeah. It's a nice little thing to add, because there are some cinematic lenses that, most of the Marvel movies and big blockbuster movies are cropped so that any lens distortion isn't there, but if there's a long, far away shot and they use a different lens, you might see some that they actually compensate for in post. And this is how they'll kind of get it that way. But this is just a little finishing thing to add onto it, little split RGBs. It's a fun time. You can add whatever you want, sprinkle some things on there. It's cool. If you want to take one of the color channels and add a bit of a glow, I don't know what it's gonna look like. That looks pretty weird. So maybe avoid that. It's all about tinkering here. You wanna do some cool things. You wanna make it look all weird. Do it, because it's fun. But that's when you get to kind of experiment with it and bring the whole thing back together. Yeah, so that basically covers the step-by-step workflow as to starting with footage and compositing things together. You can use the most commonly used programs for this are, for consumer usage, it's After Effects. Nuke is more professional level, and Flame especially for compositing. Cinema 4D is also more consumer level and commercial level for actual commercials, and but in Europe it is I think I say this every time we have one of these workshops. In Europe it is the industry standard for movies. That's because it works and they're smart about that. But we use Maya over here, which crashes and is not very nice. But yeah, so you can use it in all the programs. Cinema does have a lot more opportunity to facilitate the process, streamline it. And yeah, so you can download Nuke, I think, non-commercial license for free. You just can't render out above 1080p, but it's a good thing if you want to get into this stuff and know what the professionals are using. After Effects, freelancers can do whatever, as long as the client gets something they like. And yeah, that's about it for my presentation. Oh, the other way, if you do, you can go to the point of recreating your scene if all of your data is tight enough to completely forgo rotoscoping. You can recreate, like a lamppost in there and cover it with your 3D modeled one, and then use the footage as the texture so that it is above the plane, just like I showed with the back panels here. I kind of showed this all working. Yeah. So that's another way to go about that. But yeah, that's about it for me.